Welcome to the 9th edition of the webinar series, Habitat Forum, that is INHAF, and many of its friends are hosting for the past 2 months. As you know, 8 webinars have been completed. Program for 5 more is in public domain, and we plan hosting as many as 30 webinars, and all of them are on the same theme, that is rethinking cities, in fact, rethinking Indian cities. Now, 2 of the webinars have been on migrant labors for understandable reasons. 2 that we have finished are on city status and role as engines of economic growth. We had webinar on housing production, ownership of the city, and city as a place and city as people. I must quickly mention the themes that we are going to elaborate in the next few months. That include slums, urban poverty, governance, urban mobility, technology for cities, resource mobilization for investment, youth and city, women and city, in fact, Gandhi and city as well. So these are the kind of themes we hope to deal with. INHAF, we are grateful to Dr. Souvanic for accepting to anchor this webinar on rethinking urban missions. Dr. Roy is a professor at Department of Architecture, Town and Regional Planning, and also the founder director of School of Ecology, Infrastructure, and Human Settlements Management at the Indian Institute of Engineering Science and Technology, Shibpur, Howrah in West Bengal. And of course, we also have a very distinguished panel who will work with Dr. Souvanic. That includes Professor Banarjee, Professor Tathagata Chatterji, Dr. Renu Desai, Dr. P.K. Sasidharan, and Professor Himanshu Burte. As you know, they're all doctors and professors, very distinguished people, and therefore there's a lot that we learn from them. Now, before I hand over to Dr. Souvanic Roy and his panel, let me tell you briefly why we are doing this webinar series and why we are doing as many as 30 webinars that we are working on. Now, in India as elsewhere, as you know, cities are the future. In India, 35% of the people now live in cities, and by 30 more years, we will have 50% of the people living in cities. Cities are also engines of economic growth. Anywhere between 65 to 68% of the GDP is produced there, and in the next few years, 70% of the GDP will be produced in cities. Cities are also in centers of knowledge, technology, culture, arts, innovation, and also the last refuge of the poor people trying to escape the rural poverty. Now, this makes them centers of hope and future. But this is only the one side of the story. The other side of the story is there too, that our cities are not in pink of health. Something is not right in the way we plan, where we manage, and we develop our cities. Let me give very quickly examples of our capitals. Delhi is the political capital of country. Its air is so polluted that the High Court at one point described it as the gas chamber. Mumbai is the wealth capital of the country. More than half its population live in slums. Varanasi is the spiritual and the religious capital of the country. Ganga is so polluted, we require special ministry to clean it up. These are symbolic examples, but bring out clearly that we need to do something to change the ways we manage and develop our cities. Now, when one talked about those capitals, one was talking about reducing pollution, talking about dealing with slums and housing stress, taking care of natural resources like rivers. This was just the existing part. The future part is equally difficult and formidable. We've got to get ready to absorb as many as 820 million people by 2050. We've got to find $640 billion in next 20 years to uncreate capacity of the local bodies, to spend them well in building urban infrastructure. We've got to be creating millions of jobs for 800 million people who are below the age of 35. And we've got to restructure our economy when 90% of the labor force is in the informal sector. There's also another very important factor when you talk about urbanization in the context of India. That in India, urbanization is not a change in nomenclature. It's not from rural to urban. It's not from village to city. It is being and becoming a new society. And therefore, it is our collective responsibility to see that the new society is healthy, inclusive, just, equitous, tolerant, and compassionate. And if you are really looking for such society, such cities, you cannot leave the task entirely to the government. Providing cities, producing cities of this nature is a societal task and a societal responsibility. And therefore, this webinars is an effort to take urban challenge to the people, to the town hall. Is an effort to find and engage people in the task of city making. It is telling people in industry, in business, in academic world, in civil society, in professions, that they have a role to play in making our cities better and more livable. That is the kind of task that we are addressing ourselves. To do that, we will launch a project which is called Citiori, Citizens Urban Initiative, on which fair amount of information is available on our website, and you also may contact us at some point of time. Having introduced the project, webinars, and cities, I hand it over to Professor Souvanic to conduct today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Kitty, and good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the webinar, Rethinking Urban Missions, organized by INHAF. We are living in extremely uncertain times. Perhaps most severe disruption happened since independence in our economy and social life. The daily spikes in COVID-19 cases in our cities, big and small, and in the peri-urban areas, which are drivers of our economy, raising questions about the prospects of our urban dream that we nurtured since liberalization in 1990s. Indian urbanization, as in other countries in the global south, is a great paradox. 450 million urban population living in population is more than the population of Europe and America, contributes 65% of the GDP. On the other hand, what we found, the outbreak of the pandemic laid bare the life and livelihood conflicts through return migration of millions of informal sector population who became cashless and hungry. Absence of basic urban safety net and the disconnect between housing, livelihood, and public health nexus became evident. The basic reason for this is, unlike the North America and Europe, urbanization in the global south is primarily driven by informality of work, informality of infrastructure, housing, and both governance. Since 2005, India witnessed fast tracking of urban growth through mission mode rejuvenation to promote urban reforms and efficiency. In 2015, we embarked upon a very ambitious smart cities mission for 100 cities to make them in a world with pockets of affluence with area-based development as their focus. Contrasting opinions about the growth focus and efficacy of this formality and poverty and other things, and social and environmental resilience of our cities. So this pandemic provides us an opportunity to introspect on this urban strategy, the urban trajectory, and examine their potential to address these long-standing structural limitations. In this webinar, we'll discuss with 5 very eminent experts in different fields about this urban trajectory, the unfolding of urban development strategies, particularly the missions, and their impact using a lens of public housing, livelihood, and public health. We'll conduct the conversation in 3 stages. The first part, the questions will be asked to 5 speakers on urban trajectory and prevailing paradigms of urban policy and urban missions. Then after we finish this part, we'll go to the second part with again a set of questions to the speakers. How COVID-19 has exposed the fault lines of the prevailing or existing paradigm. And then we'll go to the third part on what are the possibilities of reorientation of the urban strategy and repurposing of the urban missions towards a more resilient urban future. So as it's a very tight schedule, I request the speakers for every question to maximum 5 to 6 minutes. And after the 3 stage of presentation, we'll open this discussion to the audience and we'll take up questions from the audience. Either every speaker will find their appropriate question and write in the question answer box, or also give their opinions on this. So with this, I briefly I request the audience to kindly post their questions in the question answer box. And if you have any comments in the chat box, please segregate these two so that it will be easier, because time is very short and it's a very tight schedule. So please write your questions in the question box, and we'll also try to find out the questions from there. So without further delay, I now moving to our first speaker of this session, Professor Himanshu Burte, who is Associate Professor in Center for Urban Science and Engineering in IIT Mumbai. And he is an expert on urban policy, and he's also on architecture. So my first question to Himanshu is, over the last 2 decades, what has been the effect of planning and urban policy on urban vulnerability? Especially if you look it through the nexus or relation between housing, livelihood, and public health, and how this trajectory has created the situation on which COVID has actually burst out upon. Over to Himanshu for his presentation, and I request Himanshu to kindly restrict within 6 minutes.
Thank you, Souvanic. So I see as I'll look at 2 main things that in response to what you said. So one is that what we have seen over the last 2 decades, but it's not only over the last 2 decades, there's a longer history that has led to that, is a contradictory model of development, urban development, which is significantly being steered by policy. So on the one hand, we have seen in so many cities shiny new urban infrastructure and real estate development. But at the same time, and sometimes because of these infrastructure and real estate projects, we've also seen increasing erosion of basic services. As you mentioned, Souvanic and also Kirtibhai, I think that the informalization and greater precarity of housing and livelihoods. At the same time, alongside all this futuristic hardware of expressways and broadband, etc., we've also seen a sometimes willing weakening of state institutional and technical capacity. Okay. especially when the state is adopting a mode of outsourcing many say design or policy design or many such activities. You see that this institutional capacity has been going down, even in very fairly strong cities and states. Not surprisingly, so on the one hand, this we are seeing institutional capacity go down. On the other, we've also seen increasing centralization of decision making, which has led to situations where the power to make decisions is centralized increasingly, right, from the central government or at the state level, but the responsibility of coping with these centralized decisions, which are made from a distance, is further decentralized, so that the person at the lowest end of the chain ends up, especially in this case, say in the case of housing, the beneficiary at the end of the day, or a little higher than that, the local, the ULB, the local municipal officer who has to implement, difficult to implement programs. So we have seen this happen where responsibility is decentralized but power is centralized. And this has led to policy design, certainly starting with JNM, but I'm sure it's an older history, where, for instance, an affordable housing program becomes into an unaffordable dishousing program for many, right? But so this is at a broad level. At a more specific level, related to what we are seeing, the high level of vulnerability, acute vulnerability we saw in COVID. This really, the last 20 years has in many ways been the era of unsettling. We know that housing is a key variable for all kinds of resilience together, especially for the poor, and in step with, of course, livelihoods. Now, central to the idea of housing is the possibility of settling with choice, with choice in terms of where you settle, settling with choice in terms of what you get connected to, the connections you sustain, etc. So in this sense, this has been an era of unsettling in many different ways. That I feel has really reduced resilience, and this and increased injustice, inequality, and now we are seeing ill health, which I don't think we've really begun to see the ill health part. Really, will soon be seeing it in a short while. So this unsettling has become visible in many different ways before COVID, right? Which is the fact that a circular migrant or seasonal migrant cannot just find a way of settling into the city. Decent housing which has some decent tenure is not possible. But at the same time, you have the eviction that happens in the city even during COVID. We have seen that the dispossession or loss of farmlands or fishing opportunities for the rural villager who happens to be in the path of the highway or the port. So both kinds of unsettling are involved, and this is clearly. Though this is a longer history again post independence and not just to do with cities, though it has impacted cities, I think it is very clear that the growing importance of the space economy and especially of land has been a major driver, and policy has actually embraced this move of the commodification of land in so many different ways, right? And so I would say that we need to recognize that unsettling of various kinds sharpens vulnerability. And what we have, I think a good analogy is to think of, how poor the success rate of transplanting is. I think policy has a certain kind of imagination very often where people can simply be taken from here and put there. But we know that that doesn't work even with trees, right? So, and worse than that is when you actually do that resettlement. We are seeing in Mumbai, we have created new disasters, and certainly we have perpetuated old ones, even though you have created planned housing colonies. But it's not simply that we have created planned housing colonies, we have created a whole new range of different kinds of unsettled kind of spaces, from temporary transit camps that become permanent or are never permanent or neither temporary nor permanent, so you're in limbo. So I think we have to recognize that it is an accumulation of various kinds of different policy interventions in the last 20 years, but which have their roots further back in history, which are driven certainly by a focus on a very narrow understanding of the economy and what it means to to get the economy to grow, and which the other side of which focus has really been a complete being in denial almost of the reality and the conditions of the people on whose labor the city really runs, right? Whether they are from within the city or people who come in and go out of the city. So I think this really has set us up perfectly for a much greater vulnerability. And I should just end by saying that it's not just the vulnerability of the poor. I think they're also beginning to see, get a glimpse of the vulnerability of the city as a whole, right? That this creates.
Okay, thank you, Himanshu. Taking clue from your issue of unsettling, that is probably the biggest thing what we saw. The people who thought about they are settled, just overnight they became unsettled, and we saw that effect. So taking cue from this, I now go to Renu, Dr. Renu Desai, who is an independent researcher in Ahmedabad and also a visiting professor in CEPT University. My first question to Renu is, what has been the relationship of urban missions, various urban missions, whether it is JNURM or Amrut or PMAY and all, to the migrant of our cities in very specific?
Yes, thanks, Souvanic. Thanks to INHAF, first of all, for organizing this and giving me a chance to kind of air some of the perspectives that I have, a lot of which come from research over the last few years on circular migration and housing. So I want to actually first start by responding to Souvanic's question by saying that, when I'm saying migrants, because that word is, it is used in various ways. And when I say migrants, I'm often referring to circular migrants, right? And many of who are interstate migrants, but many are also, intrastate circular seasonal migrants. Having said that, I also do not want to set up a rigid binary between circular migrants and those who are more permanently settled in one place or in a particular city. So, for example, and Himanshu mentioned this, that, new migrants could start out as circular migrants, and over time, some of them may become more permanently settled and they aspire to and seek to, and not everyone does, but many of them also do. And so I don't want to set up that rigid binary, as I said, between circular migrants and those who are sort of more permanently settled. And there is also great heterogeneity amongst the circular migrants also on various dimensions, right? So for instance, there are those who come to urban areas to work for a season, right? Seasonal migrants, say 3-4 months of the year. There are others who are in the city for several months. There are still others who are in the city almost all year round, but still consider the village as their primary home, often because they are single male, female migrants with family in the village. So, they're part of the remittance economy. Or even if they're families, they still go back and forth because they may be engaged in below subsistence farming in the village. And in fact, as we have seen with the COVID situation, many of those who we had not thought of as circular migrants, right? We thought that they were kind of permanently settled in the city among the urban poor, those working in the informal sector. We have seen that return migration amongst many of them as well, right? So I think it is important for us to think of migrants as being along a spectrum with varying levels of settlement in the city, varying depths of belonging in the city, varying relationships to the city or even multiple cities, because there are migrants who, with every migration cycle, they may be going and working in different cities. So varying relationships to the city and their village. And where these relationships can also change over time due to a variety of reasons. So that I wanted to kind of say that, to think more conceptually about what do we mean when we say migrants. So while I want to focus on the urban missions with regard to the circular migrants, I also don't want to set up this binary. The other thing that I want to flag up before I go off to the missions is that, we generally tend to use the term migrant for the urban poor who have come to the city, right? Either from rural areas or even smaller urban centers, either from within the state, but often from another state. Whereas many among the middle class and upper class elites are also migrants, right? That is, they were not born in the cities they now live in. Therefore, the use of the term migrant is also not neutral, but very tightly linked to the politics around migration, right? Which revolves around the migration of the poor, and more so, in some cases, interstate migrant workers who are seen as a burden on the city, as undeserving of the city resources or the state's resources when they are from other states. And this politics around migration also explicitly or implicitly informs, I think, the urban strategy, how it's implemented, etc. So I think we have to be cognizant of the politics of this issue and this language. So, while I think that it's a very good thing that circular migrants have become more visible to us, right? They're being recognized for the first time. We're talking about them because of the hardships they've faced because of COVID. We must also not lose sight of the politics around migration, which is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. And the fact that only certain groups get labeled as migrants in the city. Right. So while the urban missions, as I'll explain, have been largely anti-migrant either by design or in implementation, this is really anti sort of poor migrants and not really against migrants who are from middle class and elite backgrounds, and many of us must be migrants. Right. So I think in that context of the politics around migration, and the fact that, as I said, I don't think it's productive to set up this rigid binary between circular migrants and the permanently settled urban poor. I think it might be more productive to refocus on urban poor and low-income communities, but through a more nuanced understanding, right, and framework that recognizes, that this is a very heterogeneous group with migration status or dynamics as just one axis of that heterogeneity. And I'll come back to this later, probably at the end. So anyway, I think, I think as Souvanic mentioned, we're talking about, cities in India being home to something like 450 million population. And recent figures in this COVID situation about the numbers of circular migrants in India are kind of varying somewhere between 200 and 250 million, many of whom would be in urban areas. And despite this very large presence of circular migrants in cities, I think the fact that urban policy and planning has turned a complete blind eye to their needs of housing, basic services and amenities, livelihood-related needs, and other public goods in the city is something that we need to really begin to think about. And I think what Himanshu was saying, that a broader trajectory has been around how land has been increasingly commodified, right? The commodification of land is driving urban development, is driving policy, and policy is kind of encouraging land commodification. But to focus on the urban missions specifically, many of which are also focused on, basic services for the urban poor, housing for the urban poor. So how do we think about these missions? What do we see in these missions in relation to these migrants? Now, what I would say is that
Renu, can I come back to you again
okay,
after the first round of discussion?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So I now move to Tathagata Chatterji, Professor Tathagata Chatterji, who is Professor Urban Management and Governance, Xavier University. Tathagata, coming to the missions, what do you think, like Himanshu has discussed and partially Renu also has discussed, that lack of the migrant consideration of the migrants and in the missions, or the poor migrants in the urban areas, which are quite large in number. What do you think, how effective the urban missions are addressing the multiple dimensions of urban living, especially the issue of livelihood, which has come to the front in this whole conflict, life and livelihood conflict, and the health, that is life and livelihood, that is and health. So I request Tathagata to present his views.
Yeah, thank you, Souvanic. And first of all, I'd also like to thank INHAF for this opportunity of being here. Now coming back to this question of the utility of the missions for towards the livelihood and the health. Well, there are basically, I mean, three major missions which are working in this domains. On the livelihood issues, so there is this National Urban Livelihood Mission, which is under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. And then there is a Swachh Bharat Mission, which is working, which is focused on sanitation and waste disposal, which also has got a health dimension. This mission is also under the Ministry of Urban Affairs. And then there is a National Urban Health Mission, which was established way back in 2013. And this is under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Now, regarding the performances of these missions had been very varied. And I mean, there are a lot of variations between the missions and also within the missions between state to state, because India is a very, very complicated country, and the state level capacities vary quite substantially. So the same mission performs quite well in some states, but not in others. There are also big differences about the allocation of the missions per se. The Swachh Bharat mission, which is really a flagship mission for the current government, which has got a fairly good budget of about 2,650 crores. But whereas the budget for urban livelihood mission is awfully insignificant, it is just about 750 crores. And the budget for National Urban Health Mission, which is again, I mean, only about 950 crores. So the performance of the missions are being quite linked to how much money being put into the missions and how they are administered in the states. And so considering, I mean, the points raised by Himanshu and Renu, I completely agree. I mean, about we are moving towards more financialization of urban policy since the beginning of the new liberal turn of the country. The allocations for towards this missions had been which are really bottom up. That's National Urban Health Mission, which was set up in 2013 to specifically focus on the health dimensions in the slum areas. It has now fallen very much behind. Urban Livelihood Mission, again, I mean, it is functioned fairly well in Kerala and Andhra to some extent, but not much effective in, it has been effective in patches in different cities. I mean, I stay in Odisha. In Odisha, it has been quite effective in Berhampur, but not so much in several other cities. Swachh Bharat Mission, in comparison, obviously has featured much better. There can be debate about how ODA-free India has really become. But on certain other parameters like door-to-door waste collection or waste processing, there had been some considerable amount of improvement. And in National Urban Livelihood Mission, I think, I mean, and National Urban Health Mission, I think, I mean, these are the two missions which are very much appropriate for the current crisis that we are facing due to this COVID situation, which has kind of, I mean, exposed the vulnerabilities of the urban poor in the cities in a very stark manner. So, I mean, the funding for these two missions had been very small, and the in NULM, I mean, which provides jobs for the people at the very bottom of the pyramid through forming self-help groups. And mostly these are women-run self-help groups. The number of group registrations has gone up, but that does not really reflect, I mean, the performance, I mean, how the mission is performing, and how the self-help groups are being delivering. You know, I mean, there is a lack of, I mean, proper measurement to understand their functions and utilities. Also, there had been persons registered under the self-employment programs has also gone up. But I mean, there needs to be an audit, a follow-up audit to understand how effective the training had been. In several cities under this mission, there had been the survey of the street vendors, the registration of the street vendors. About 2,000 cities, this survey has been done. And about, I mean, 18 lakh street vendors have been surveyed, and out of which, I mean, 9 lakh people have been given the ID cards. But again, you know, I mean, functioning of the city level committees for the vendors, I mean, their functioning had been quite patchy. So by and large, I would say, I mean, the performance of the missions towards the livelihood and the health had not really been given that much priority, considering the amount of urban poverty that is in place in the country.
Okay, Tathagata, I'll come back to you again in the second part. Now our next panel speaker is Professor Banarjee, who is an urban planning expert, urban planning and housing expert, Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies, Rotterdam, Netherlands. Professor Banarjee, you being a housing expert, my question will be in the area of housing, that is, what are the defining elements of the urban housing trajectory in last 2 decades or 1.5 decades? And how the missions have worked or performed in the connected areas of housing and public health?
Thank you very much, Souvanic, and thanks to INHAF as well. And thank you very much to the panelists who preceded me, because they have set the background of basically of policy and development paradigm and stuff like that in this country in the last decade and a half. So I'll go directly to the missions. And we find that, you know, since 2005, when the JNNURM, Jawaharlal Mission was conceived, we have, you know, some major changes which took place in these housing missions, as they're called. First of all, we had this use of the word mission as against the earlier schemes. And that has its kind of implication that missions come with some kind of urgency, and missions also come with some kind of targets which are defined and so on. Yeah? So the first thing that happened was that as part of this you know, process of development and looking at cities as engines of growth, the importance of urban increased in policy. You had bigger allocations. And the first of the programs that reflected this was JNNURM, which was in 63 mission cities. Now, JNNURM also ushered in a kind of citywide approach to looking at housing, because you had, you know, conditional to the release of funds from the central government was the preparation of a city development plan, which also included the components of the BSUP, the Basic Urban Services for the Poor, which was part of JNNURM. Then after that, when we go on to the next program, which is this Rajiv Awas Yojana, you see that there's the slum-free city plan of action, yeah, which is supposed to define what happens with the slums in the city. It also came with the slogan of slum-free India, slum-free city. So kind of value loaded in that way. And then, but then the positive thing was that it was looking at a citywide approach. Then came the present Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, PMA, and that also, requires a citywide kind of canvas. So cities have to prepare housing for all plan of action, which is very much on the lines of what they did for Ray, the kind of philosophy. And then we see that the gradual scaling up of these urban housing projects. Now, PMA has a nationwide target covering 4,041 urban areas. I started with the target for the first time in the housing history of public housing history of India, started with the target of 20 million houses, which then got scaled down to 1.12 million, which was based on demand from the states apparently. The next change that we find is that as against the earlier programs, which gave a lot of emphasis to improving housing conditions through the provision of basic infrastructure and organizing communities to look after some of this infrastructure and stuff like that, we have an increasing emphasis on construction of houses. So even though we call it housing, it's really houses which are the emphasis of the whole thing. Yeah. And even though you had slum upgrading as part of BSUP, you find that the emphasis was on redevelopment housing, which is actually construction of housing, and less on improvement of infrastructure. And then the next thing, and we'll see how this impacted on this health and livelihood linkages with housing. Then another thing which happened as part of the market-led approach, which the government decided to follow in the 90s, was that it got crystallized into an increasing role of the formal private sector. But then not only that, the other thing that happened is that the government started looking at land as a resource. Yeah. So that means monetizing land and not looking at it as a social kind of product. So looking at land as a resource, lots of incentives were given to the private sector, like transfer of development rights, higher floor space index, tax exemptions, access to land, which was public land through PPP projects, and also reforms to make it easier to convert agriculture land to urban. Then there was also linked to this the financial reforms to both support the demand and supply side. And then another significant thing that happened was the gradual decimation of the role of community groups and civil society, and an increase in the top-down kind of agenda of government. Yeah? So I will, at this stage, I will look at...
Banashree, can I come back to you in the next, because we have another 2 sessions. So can you just, is it possible to combine this with the next phase of our question?
It is, okay.
Okay. So our next speaker is Professor P.K. Sasidharan, Dr. P.K. Sasidharan. He is Emeritus Professor in Family Medicine, Govt.Medical College, Kozhikode, Kerala. So you being the medical expert doctor, my question on this issue of public health is, what are the pitfalls of public health from a physician's perspective, and how far the National Urban Health Mission meet the healthcare needs and challenges for urban population, specifically the urban poor.
Can you see the screen now?
Yeah, yeah.
Public health, in fact, is the science and art of preventing disease and promoting health. But in India, as a whole, we forget what is healthcare itself. I would say that we do not have social determinants of health like safe drinking water to all distributed through pipes. In fact, even the neighboring countries like Sri Lanka also has made it. India probably is one of the very few countries which has not ensured safe drinking water distributed through pipes. Most of the countries have it. We are not bothered about it even. We are still are proud of distributing it in plastic bottles. No one knows what a balanced diet is. 98.5% of people, we had done a survey, found that none of them knows what is a balanced diet. Leave alone empowered for eating, or how many of us have a decent shelter? We may be having it, but many do not have it. And there are houses without toilets. Sanitation facilities are not there. About 50% may not be having it. We do not have clean and safe environment. Waste management, we have just started talking about waste management. When all the countries have achieved almost perfect waste management, Sweden has become zero waste, and they are even capable of managing waste from other countries. We are not bothered about facilities for doing exercise, social gathering, and recreation, and all these are ignored. These are the social determinants of health. Once you ensure all these, only you can have healthy individuals in any society. In fact, healthy individuals reflect they actually represent the social security and human development, which ensures the social determinants of health to every individual. We do not have an organized primary education. That is another pitfall. Because why I'm telling about primary education is, good primary education will transform each child into good human beings. It is lack of humanness that has prevented us from growing in the right direction. And in that scenario, we have maximum number of patients. You name any disease, we are number one in the world in any disease, not in just numbers, in percentages also. Almost all the diseases, we are number one. We have become the capital of all diseases. And in that scenario, for treatment, we do not have family doctors. Family doctors or primary care doctors or general practitioners, all are same. But India is the only country which do not have family doctors as a priority. Almost all are working only as specialist doctors. We should ensure the people for practicing good lifestyle. They should be empowered for it. Among them, these are the components of a good lifestyle, including balanced diet, awareness about how to avoid overeating, awareness about what to avoid, and drinking water, waste disposal habits, exercise habits. All these are good lifestyle habits. And these good lifestyle habits have to be made known to every individual, and they should be empowered for practicing it. Then only we can say that we are providing healthcare. Nobody knows what a balanced diet is. I'm not going to narrate it. This is a balanced diet which has 5 components, but none of us has been practicing it. Even I didn't know till I was 45 years. Started exploring and found it out almost now only, but I'm now sharing with other people on how to practice it. And finally, after ignoring all these social determinants of health, you name any disease, we are number one. I could not find any disease where we are even number 2. I had been believing that in HIV we were number 2, but Africans believe that India is number 1 and they are number 2. And how do we tackle diseases? On one side, we do not have social determinants of health. And we should know that diseases occur among the marginalized sections. Any disease you name is a result of one or other kind of marginalization. Even diseases like diabetes, hypertension are a kind of marginalization. You did not know how to prevent it. We should have been educated about how to prevent it, but we were not aware of it. So it is a marginalization that finally leads us or pushes us into diseases. And then when marginalized people, more marginalized ones will be having more number of diseases. But when it comes to making hospitals, we are making hospitals for the rich ones. It's a totally unscientific approach. We are following the USA model, the worst model in the world, where everything is for the rich. Only rich can afford treatment there. About 5 crores of people in the USA cannot afford any treatment. If you have money, you will get everything there. This is the kind of unscientific use of resources which made India #1 in diseases. On one side, no social determinants of health in spite of being very rich. India is not a poor country. It is in fact one of the richest countries, but all our wealth is lying unused as dead investments in gold and other secret places, cash in secret boxes. We make more corporate hospitals than government hospitals. We have more specialists than GPs or family doctors. And now finally what has happened is, even the poor people go to big private hospitals, corporate hospitals. They even sell their property for treatment, and they end up in drug traps after treatment. And then what does the government do? Government might reimburse these expenses. Finally, all the money, whatever money we have, is going to private hospitals. And we use technology in the name of science. In fact, science is all about studying nature, events and things, and observing, experimenting, and learn how the world works. And then finally, you apply logical thinking, logical behavior, and using common sense. If you use all this, it is science. For example, we will not do anything to prevent the child falling into a bowel like this. It could have been prevented by just 100 rupees, by closing its mouth or keeping a barricade there. But we will not do it, but the child will fall into it. It has happened a number of times. But once a child falls, all the technology is applied to dig out the child, which is almost dead. Recently, in a science fair, one student designed an equipment to feed a child who falls into a bowel. This is technology without common sense. Like fighting a war is technology, but preventing a war is...
Yeah, Dr. Sasidharan, can I come back to you again and in the next part?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I'll request our speakers to kindly look at the chat, the question answer box to the questions, and I'm moving to the second part. So as we are running a bit short of time, so what I'm proposing is to combine the second and third part of the impact of COVID on these, exposing the fault lines of these various sectors and the future possibilities or opportunities to address these structural limitations, what we have discussed in the first section. So, and I again request the audience to kindly post your questions in the question box so that our panelists will take a look at this and then answer in the after we finish our panel speaking. So I again come back to Himanshu. So discuss that based on your discussion on your urban policy, the background, what is the impact of COVID and how the policy understood that COVID at all? It is understood, the urban policy, and what in your opinion is what the course corrections which are required in the policy and planning to move gradually towards resilience, because resilience cannot happen overnight, suddenly. So how the policy can move towards gradually towards resilience?
Okay, so of course this is a fantastically large question, and nobody, I think, will be foolish enough or brave enough to answer
you have
fully.
you have 7 minutes for your
that's maybe 3 minutes more than I need, right? So okay, so let me just and there are also some very interesting questions in the Q&A which we can also take on later, but I think it's actually difficult to know where to begin in talking about what COVID has shown us. One thing certainly it has done, COVID, is shown us, it has made the crisis that has been kind of hidden in the city. Okay, the crisis of poverty, vulnerability, hunger. I think we saw hunger. I don't think we have talked of hunger as an urban phenomenon in a very long time. We've always thought of hunger as something which is out there in the rural, right? But all of these things became very visible What also became very visible was the the fact that for such a large number of people, the city is not even the barest of homes. They have no anchor, nothing that will guarantee their minimal bodily, not even social, minimal bodily survival in the city. Okay, and we all know it over a long period of time. But I think it made it very, very vivid. And but beyond all of these things which were playing out on TV and on social media, I think it is for me what it has shown is is how little we as both as citizens or as academics or even as state actors, how little we know the city. There's one complexity of understanding, the various processes and all of that, but there's even the basic fact of knowing something very, very just having at least some sense of say the level of poverty or the holding capacity of say people when you start a lockdown, how long can they survive on their own. So none of these at a very, very basic level seem to be there in any institutionally or organized manner. And as Renu spoke about the we are not even maybe as academics we have some sense, though I know we don't really have like numbers at all, and the state certainly doesn't have a sense of what is this entire quantum of the migrant workforce. Right? We have it could be 150, it could be 300 million. I mean, that is quite a range. If you have that kind of lack of understanding of not just the city itself, but the processes that continue to make the city what it is, okay, and which stretch across large geographies, I think we have a fundamental problem of knowledge. There was a question in the question and answers, which is very, very basic, and the answers are too many. But how have we failed? How have cities failed the citizen? I think certainly at one level by having no curiosity, no institutional curiosity about what the city is in the first place. How does it run? Who is in the city? What is required? What are the ways in which the existing structures of the urban economy and social life, what are the ways in which these make a lot of people vulnerable? What are the new special kind of vulnerabilities that are there, and what therefore needs to be done to correct all the lopsidedness of the economy? For instance, it's just one aspect. And for me, this lack of knowledge is also tied to the lack of, I think, care. There's very clearly a lack of real commitment to really making the city work well for all. I think there is, so at an attitudinal level, at the level of knowledge, there is, I think, a lot of this is the COVID crisis has highlighted very fundamental problems. I'll stop there because this is actually an unending kind of topic.
Okay, so I move to Renu now. I like to get some of your feedback on the varying situation in the states, along with if you have a look at the question box, if you have something more to add. So what is your opinion on the if you can give some opinion on the varying situation in the states, and particularly with respect to one very important aspect of development is gender. So in this migrant section, if there is any specific point in terms of gender discrimination, which has been highlighted in many newspaper articles and also in other reports. Renu, please unmute.
Sorry. So I think one thing I want to very quickly sort of go over is, I think even one of the questions kind of asked about, how the missions, very specifically what their agenda and objectives have been and how they've responded or not to the urban poor. And so I think I want to kind of say a couple of things about that, which is, one is that, while none of the missions obviously have had an explicit recognition of migrant groups, or even explicitly taken an anti-migrant stance. I think implicitly the various urban missions have been largely ignored, this kind of circular migrant population. Right, but at the same time, there are some varying relationships there between the different missions. So, for instance, if you think about PMAY, and I think Banashree will probably talk more about this, but looking at PMAY specifically from the lens of the circular migrants, then sort of these kind of housing programs are simply inaccessible to circular migrants because they're just not eligible given the kind of documentary proofs they're required to have. The fact that many may not be looking towards house ownership, which is the emphasis in PMAY, right? So this whole sector of rental housing, worker hostels, Banashree also talked about the fact that, you know, in situ upgrading of our existing informal settlements with basic services has been pushed to the side, and PMAY has become this house construction kind of program, right? So all of these things have led to this housing mission being quite biased against these kind of circular migrants, whether they're tenants or whether they're squatters, homeless, and also those who are living at work sites, right? A large number of migrants live at work sites, which is completely a space that is off our chart altogether. If you think about something like Swachh Bharat Mission, very interestingly, the guidelines actually mention something about migrant groups, construction workers, and having, you know, adequate facilities at work premises, but none of this has been implemented. And so obviously not only are most cities that have declared themselves open defecation free, they're not actually open defecation free because a lot of migrants especially continue to resort to open defecation. And again, whether they are squatters, whether they're homeless, whether they're living at work sites, right? So these different spaces of migrants, of this kind of circular migrant labor, I think is completely not in our view. Right, we think about all of the urban poor and migrants living in slums, but what that term means and what kind of spaces that encompasses is often quite limited in some respects, because a lot of spaces don't even qualify as slums, even in an academic or analytical lens. And these kind of issues, you know, as I said, these are the fault lines in our cities, and the missions have contributed to this. And gender also, you know, gender exclusions around questions of access to water, which again was a main objective of Amrut as a mission, right? One of its main objectives was to ensure that every household has access to a tap with assured water supply and a sewerage connection. But when again this kind of circular migrant population and the different spaces it inhabits in the cities is completely not part of the way in which then the missions think about the city space and how then the plans are made for different projects, and therefore these migrants do not have access to these services. A lot of them, the burden of that lack of access or inadequate access falls on women, and we know this. There's such a large you know, scholarship on those kind of questions around gender and water, gender and sanitation. And I think this whole question of, you know, especially in the context of the pandemic, you know, we've been hearing repeatedly about, you know, washing your hands frequently and all of this kind of stuff. And we are really, the whole question of ensuring hygiene in this manner is so impossible when such a large population of the city simply doesn't have access, because these programs have not actually extended these services to these groups in the city, right? And when you, if you think about gender in terms of the impacts of COVID itself, I think that's what Souvanic also wanted me to talk about, is that, I mean, obviously there's, you know, the water sanitation aspect, which is a, you know, all of these have longer histories of exclusions, and then the COVID situation has just deepened the effects that it can have on all of the groups, regardless of gender. But in terms of gender specifically, I think one of the things that we've perhaps seen, which again, I maybe one of the other speakers would talk about how the National Urban Health Mission saw these migrant spaces as, you know, ways of giving access to better nutrition, childcare, all of this to women. And again, one of the things we've seen prior to the pandemic is again that these migrant spaces have been completely bereft, whether they're work sites, whether they're homeless spaces, or these kind of squatter settlements of migrants. You don't have, you know, Anganwadis, for instance, running in them. So when the government also said that, right, one of the directives was that the Anganwadi workers should continue to kind of now go and provide these services at home, right? But these kind of migrant spaces were completely left out. Of course, I'm sure that a lot of the other groups who were benefiting from Anganwadis earlier also ended up not being covered, and this would change from city to city depending on how that got implemented. But I think in terms of the impact of the COVID situation on women, I think one of the key things on migrant women has been that under COVID, again, they have been completely sidelined in terms of, you know, the imagination of what needs to be done to extend these relief measures or directives that the government made to address the kind of issues that were coming up because of the lockdown, etc. And of course, there are so many, I mean, again, I think as Himanshu said, there are such a wide array of issues here in terms of impacts as well as in terms of what sort of needs to be done in the future. And I think maybe I'll just say a sentence or two, because I'm sure that, you know, running out of time and others need to speak. But I think one of the key things that I see, again, talking from a migrant perspective, is that, you know, the fact that, of course, overall, we've seen our cities moving towards a exclusionary kind of model of development. And this is across kind of the urban poor. But nonetheless, to whatever greater or lesser extent, those who've been more permanently settled in the city, who have become voters, despite many exclusions in the city, have an increasing precarity, which Himanshu also mentioned. And nonetheless, to some extent, they're able to navigate access to certain public resources through political pressure, right, on elected, you know, representatives or networks that they form with the local bureaucracy, etc. Whereas I think circular migrants, really the question of sort of political voice and being able to access state resources has been a big question mark. And I think one of the short-term things that I see that needs to be done, if one is to continue with this mission mode, is that at least on an urgent basis to reorient some aspects of these missions towards rolling out some of these services and, you know, access to certain kinds of public goods, which the missions promise in a lot of their guidelines and language, to actually roll them out and roll them out across, universalize them to city residents, and not kind of have these stringent eligibility criteria, you know, open up this question of, you know, recognition of different spaces where migrants are living, right? And there's a lot more I could say about that. But in the longer term, I think clearly we just need a big shift in our planning and the way in which we think about cities, not as, you know, through this lens of sort of beautification and the kind of things that drives, versus thinking about cities as a place that, you know, opens up opportunities for every resident or every even temporary resident who chooses to come and live and work there for a while.
Thank you, Renu. City is a space of opportunity. Yeah,
yeah,
so
and
that's
no, and in relation to that, I just want to say, therefore, to link up to what one of the other speakers said, is that I think this question of public health, really we need to expand our notions of what that is and link it to questions of housing and livelihood. We have a very narrow focus on public health, and how we approach our urban missions, urban planning, governance needs to deal with that expanded notion of public health. So I'll end with that.
Yeah. So thank you, Renu. I now move to Tathagata, so that Renu talked about reconfiguration of the missions to so that we can have an universalized approach towards various services and not for excluding for exclusionary or minority. The other point probably, which if we look into the missions or the last 2 decades of governance, when we move towards mission, it is very, very projectized and fragmented approach towards development. So can you throw some light on the issue of convergence? Because when we talk about really want to see city as an opportunity, we have to see this in terms of a more of an integrated approach. So what is your take on the issue of convergence instead of the divergence or fragmented vision, objectives of different missions moving in different directions?
It's a very interesting question, Souvanic. I think, I mean, when we look at the missions from the point of view of urban governance, I mean, there are, I'd like to, I mean, flag 3 particular points which we need to keep in mind. The first of all, from the issue of decentralization, the mission mode is certainly not the ideal way. I mean, I think, there are also some questions in the chat box on this. I mean, they're not, they goes very much against the grain of the 74th Amendment regarding state restructuring and decentralization through devolution of administrative and fiscal powers to the urban local bodies. Secondly, as the point that you are mentioning about the missions being very project-centric and kind of fragmented, yes, absolutely. I mean, I very much agree. I mean, see, the missions are, from a planning perspective, they're not linked to the master plans of the cities, and I mean, they're kind of seen as add-ons. The missions are, I mean, taking a very project oriented, narrow approach as opposed to a planning-led approach for the what is required for the city in future. I mean, there are several instances where projects are being taken up because there are funds available, not exactly whether the city needs those kind of, I mean, high-end projects or not. So they're not, the missions are not emerging out of the city's specific priorities, but driven in a very centralized, top-down manner. Thirdly, I mean, there is another issue, I mean, regarding the mission. It's about the institutional capacity building. And more, I mean, we are moving towards outsourcing of the handling of the missions. So in most cases, the missions are being executed by external consultants. And so the knowledge that accrues out of these project executions are not really internalized by the urban local bodies, and so there is no, the institutional capacity building is very limiting. A more bottom-up approach would be, I mean, to devolving the mission funds to the cities in a much more consolidated manner, so that, and also to devise a formula to share GST and other revenues between the national, state, and the local governments. So this would kind of, I mean, create a more equitable mechanism towards urban development. But also, I mean, there are, we also need to address the issues of accountability. I mean, and capacity of the cities to really bring about convergence. We also have to acknowledge the fact that particularly the very small and medium-sized towns in not so urbanized states, there is huge capacity deficit. So we need to think of, I mean, how do we bring a balance between a centralized urban development agenda and a much more bottom-up approach. Now, as we're coming to the second part of your question regarding bringing about convergence, I think, I mean, there are some steps being taken in small ways. One good example I would like to highlight that the Ministry of Urban Affairs started a scheme to bring about convergence between National Urban Livelihood Mission and the Swachh Bharat Mission, so that, I mean, the sanitation workers are being trained through the anywhere than capacity building programs, and self-help groups are given charges to maintain public toilets. But the main problem here is that, I mean, bringing convergence is a hugely complicated administrative exercise, as different projects has got different timelines, different priorities, different funding patterns. So who in the ULB is really capable of, I mean, bringing this convergence? So in that, so the ULB, another issue here is about the ULB leadership per se. The municipal commissioners who are in charge of the urban local bodies. So in many cases, there had been a study by Janagra, which in kind of very vividly brought out this issue, that on an average, the municipal commissioners has got a tenure of only about 9 months to 1 year. So, I mean, they get transferred so very frequently. So who is on the ground level can really bring about a convergence between different missions. So in that sense, I mean, there is one good example which comes to my mind is the Kudumbashree program of Kerala, which is an interesting example. It started as a rural livelihood support program in the late 1990s as part of the Kerala's People's Plan initiative. But now Urban Livelihood Mission and even PMAY are being dovetailed within it. So, you know, I mean, it has become kind of a specialized institution at a state level, which has got some sort of a centralized control point. But its methods of executions are done through urban local bodies. And in Kerala, it is, I mean, much more empowered urban local bodies. So it is it's a mix of centralization at a state level with a local level decentralization. So the people with the right skills could be moved from the state level to the ULB level for the project execution, and the convergence is done at a state level. So this is, to me, appears to be a fairly good example, but this needs to be much more replicated in other states.
Thank you, Professor Chatterji. I now move to Professor Banarjee, where you ended, taking lead from there. So how this pandemic has exposed this multi-dimensional vulnerability in the people living in slums and more in the informal settlements in India, particularly, because what we have seen now is earlier in the first phase, there was a lot of discussion about the COVID spreading in slums like Dharavi and other places, or Shivaji Nagar, and in also in Calcutta, in the Metia Buruj and all other places. But in the second phase, I'm not very sure. The second phase data is not yet much coming out, particularly in terms of the community transmission and what is happening. So I like to know your response on this. How this vulnerability, what was the vulnerability at the first stage and what is happening after that? Whether this vulnerability is increasing in certain type of settlements, or what is the situation? Because it's almost now 4 months. This is continuing. And from big cities, now it is going to smaller towns and even in peri-urban areas. So as you work entirely on the area of slums and informal settlements, so your opinion would be really appreciated on that.
Thank you once again, Souvanic. I think one of the things I'd like to flag up is that, you know, in relation again to the present mission that we have, Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, is that these places where, you know, which are vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19 are the very places which have actually not been included in this kind of program. And they're not included in any housing or infrastructure, basic infrastructure program at the moment, because we have given up on improving and providing, like Renu said, universal access to basic infrastructure to everyone. Yeah. Now, as far as PMAY is concerned, it's probably the first program of the government of India which is going to reach its targets, because the target is 1.12 million, and we are already at 1.03 million sanctions already. So it has done very well there. But then how has it done that? I mean, the thing is that one is, of course, the upward revision of income group. So at 18 lakhs, a lot of us are eligible to participate in PMAY, 18 lakhs per year. So is that where the problem is? So then the disconnect between what the issue is in terms of housing vulnerability and what the program is doing to reach its numbers is really something we need to question. The second thing is that even in these numbers, how it's been reached, like for instance, the affordable housing in partnership program. Now, all the projects are in the outskirts where there's no infrastructure. And I must say that, if we look at, for instance, the parliament questions which came up about vacant houses, are very revealing. This was it started in 2016 and 17 when the peak of this questions came up. 2 lakh of these houses constructed under PMAY were vacant. And the minister, when he went to answer this question, he said that this vacancy is, it's actually the state governments who are responsible, number one. Yeah. Number two, so it's this governance thing which is being, passing the buck thing. The second thing is that they said that these settlements, people are refusing to move in because basic services are not there, at that time. So the gap, the coordination between who provides the services and who does the housing. The third thing is that these are outside the city. So access to schools, health centers and all that is just not there. So I think it is, in Himanshu's terms, people were refusing to be unsettled, and moving to these kinds of housing projects. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we have this, huge housing programs built at tremendous amount of expense, to the taxpayer, to individuals who actually move into these houses. But the basic problem that we have seen coming up during the pandemic and, kind of bubbling up because it's always been there, is not really being addressed. But of course, now we have the fifth vertical of rental housing being added to PMAY. So that's a very good thing. But then we must, remember, like a lot of studies have shown, including Renu's study in Guwahati and, studies in Surat and Ludhiana and Gurgaon and all sorts of cities, have shown that the bulk of the rental housing being provided to migrants and also to non-migrants is in the informal sector. And the rents are low, and the rents are low because of the poor quality of construction and lack of basic services. So here again, if you have a rental housing policy, fair enough, that can serve a particular segment, but this whole thing of how people access housing, how this kind of housing is connected with livelihoods, with their connections back to the village, is something which really needs to be studied before we can actually frame interventions from the public, which can actually help the poorest people we have in our cities. And if we deal with the problems of those, we are getting into improved productivity, improved health, and all sorts of parameters like that. So I think there's a real need to get away from this counting of numbers for success and seeing that it's really the numbers we need to count is that, okay, there are so many people in the city and how many of them have do not have access to water, and how do we actually provide access to water to sanitation and all these things. And like Renu says, then we're not counting eligibility. This is something which is universal for everybody. And the amount of subsidies that are going to construct these, 1 crore plus houses, if that subsidy is released for universalizing basic services, I think a lot more people would benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Banashree, for very clearly stating this, that the objective is not the numbers. Probably we have achieved the numbers, but in the process, we lost the sight of actually what was the objective of the mission. So I now come to Dr. Sasidharan with the question that where you concluded from there, coming to the urban poor issue, how this, from a physician's perspective, how do you think is the access to health infrastructure or the disconnect of urban housing, livelihood and public health has exposed the fault lines of during the COVID for the urban poor?
It is basically the marginalization that has been exposed by COVID. The people who had problems are the people who are marginalized. You had seen that majority who had problems were in the, for example, the Mumbai, the Dharavi area, Delhi in the slums, Chennai, and even in USA, it happened in New York where the marginalized, the African Americans or African Indians were the people who were, American Indians were the people who were affected by the COVID. So it is basically the marginalization that has been exposed by COVID. I told that 98% do not even know what is a balanced diet. And that was a reason for all the complications of COVID. When they do not take a balanced diet, you naturally have deficiency of vitamins like B12, folic acid, vitamin D, and vitamin C and all. These are the people who develop complications. And none of them are balanced diet is something which is missing in our diet. They do not take vegetables and fruits. And that is why the problem of complications. I'm not able to move. Okay. This is what has resulted in the problems. We have built an inverted pyramid of healthcare. What is missing is genuine healthcare, health needs, and social health. The social determinants of health is lacking, and large number of people become patients. And then we do not have family doctors. If we had enough family doctors or primary care doctors, they would have offered better healthcare. Now what has happened is all these people are migrating to the periphery at this time of COVID. But otherwise, they would all be migrating to larger hospitals in the tertiary care centers. Now that started depending on PHCs which are poorly equipped. Even general hospitals are dying out. They are being replaced by corporate hospitals, but we have a large number of super specialty hospitals and high-tech hospitals. This inverted pyramid is collapsing, or it has almost collapsed. Now we have to rebuild it. The bottom part has to be the genuine healthcare and social determinants of health. That is the number one thing that we have to do. Always remember that all infections are due to agent, host, and environment interaction. And we focus only on the agent, the virus. We are going after the virus. We forget the host and environment. This issue is another important thing in COVID scenario. And all infections are due to poor immunity resulting from poor nutrition and poor lifestyle habits and poor personal hygiene and respiratory hygiene and lack of safe environment and unsafe drinking water and contamination of food and water. These are the reasons for all the infections that we see. But we do not focus on these basic issues, but we are just waiting to fight the virus and we are waiting for vaccine to fight the COVID-19. See, for example, this happened recently in Attapadi in Kerala. The students are not having online access for the online classes. They are doing a staging dharna. And when somebody out of their own enthusiasm comes out in flying colors, there are so many people to support them. These philanthropists have enough opportunity in a situation like this rather than correcting the basic issues. The CSR part, corporate social responsibility, is not a way to address all these basic issues. That's how I look at this. Basically, it has exposed all the vulnerabilities, and the vulnerable population has been exposed by the COVID scenario. We need to address the basic issues even to fight COVID. And even after COVID, we have to rectify that.
Okay. So I now, after this basic discussion, I now request all the speakers to kindly have a look at the question answer box. We can pick up questions of your choice, or we can discuss among ourselves also about the what kind of future we envisage, because as in case of to me it seems like that the last pandemic around a century back persisted around 2 years, 1918 to 1920. So this also is, I'm not very sure, keeping in mind that in India fatality rate is quite low, but the sheer size of infection is caseloads are quite high. And another issue, what is important for all of us, every Indian state is like a country in the Europe and American, in the North American context. So I was just listening a few days back that it is very hard to predict what will happen to India, because in the first phase, it was the most highly urbanized states having the most caseloads. And I saw a good number of articles which actually highlighted the better performance of the South, because in terms of social capital, in terms of public health infrastructure, in terms of legacy, in terms of decentralization. So that is gradually changing, and now many of them are become super spreaders. So I was wondering that what may be the approach or what may be likely to play out in, say, another 3 months. What is going to happen, how it is unfolding, and how gradually the planning can means the relief planning or the long-term planning can take a course. So anyone would be interested to answer this, or someone wants to take a question from this address to individual speakers. So it's open to all of you. So
you mean how to handle COVID in the coming
No,
months?
I was just saying either you can take up any particular question from this question box, or if I take this from physician's point of view, because we saw that we are quite unprepared in terms of public health, and even the best public health state, Kerala, is also, just yesterday I found a post by Kerala's chief minister. He's saying that people have become complacent and things are going out of hand. Still, Kerala situation is much better than others. So what do you think about, is it only about, because creating public health infrastructure takes a long time. So how in the short term, when the community transmission is happening, particularly it's now accepted by all that the community transmission is happening. So how you think that the situation can be addressed in a gradual manner? What do you think as a doctor, in a gradual manner?
What we can do now is, because the asymptomatic people tested positive are not patients. This we have to come to terms with, because people think that once you detect virus, even in an asymptomatic person, that person is treated as a patient right now. We should know that 98% of the people recover without any problem, even the symptomatic ones. There are enough asymptomatic people. The death mortality rate calculated is based on positive confirmed cases based on RT-PCR. That is 2 to 3%. If you take all the individuals, the asymptomatic including, who are not tested, the actual mortality comes to only 0.1% or so. So the mortality is very, very negligible. if at all mortality happens, it is people with several diseases, several comorbidities. 3 to 4 comorbidities are there in most of the people who die. And these would have died even due to other infections like common flu-like illness. The mass hysteria, fear psychosis built around COVID is too much. I don't know why it should have been handled in a different manner. Even Kerala has failed to take the chance because they thought that we can stop the infection coming into Kerala. It is impossible. We are going to be infected. All of us will get infected. Nothing will happen to us also. If something happens, it is to people who are vulnerable. The vulnerability is the one which we have to address even now. There are several with asymptomatic, apparently normal individuals dying, even younger people. They have several undiagnosed problems, several vitamin deficiencies which are not diagnosed. They are overweight with undiagnosed liver disease. They have several undiagnosed problems. In these days, what happens is doctors are also afraid that because of fear psychosis. In fact, even now I am examining patients without any fear. It is possible. This is one thing which we fail to project among the public, among the doctors. Everyone is living in fear of death. Fear of COVID itself has become a disease now. That we have to get out of it. So I have a plan for it.
Okay.
Okay.
So Himanshu, will you want to take any question from the question box?
Okay, there are a lot of them, so it's actually very, very difficult to pick out. But there is, of course, a kind of hunger for solutions, which I fully share. And of course, we cannot provide those solutions. There was a very interesting comment that these are very nice analysis driven by hypothesis and ideology. Now, I don't know what hypothesis, that's fine. Always we will have them. But I think even what Professor Sasidharan said to me, in a sense, underscored a number of things which are actually very obvious. And this is the unfortunate thing. There is something very basic, sensible, and obvious that we consistently seem to refuse to do. And there are, I think, number of reasons. One is that the obvious is also very complex. You talk of vulnerability, you talk of half the city being people who are very poor. You have a given land ownership arrangement, and maybe as a state or whatever kind of actor, to give them due credit, it's not an easy option, right? You add the complication of various stakes, political, economic stakes in the status quo, and then you have obviously a much more difficult kind of situation. But I feel that we have certainly no option but to move towards exactly as Dr. Sasidharan said, be more scientific rather than be more technological. Okay? I think, and science sounds like such a big thing, but it's a simple thing. You look at the fact. You don't just jump into the act before you look at the facts on the ground, right? And we actually, I think, lack a realistic and honest understanding of the way our cities as social phenomena, as physical and environmental processes, okay? We lack an understanding of that. And yet, with this very sketchy understanding, which also, please remember, is being built by people like us from a particular kind of social and economic and political position, right? So that's also a very partial kind of representation of that reality in terms of knowledge. So based on these shaky foundations, we are proposing solutions. And if you add in all the stakes that I spoke about, we are naturally going to have wonky solutions, and they are going to come up with really perverse outcomes. So we have to look at that reality. We have no option but to be more committed to a democratic process. I don't mean these as just lovely words. I think they are not simply at the level of some bleeding heart idea of justice. We have learned that a more democratic approach, which involves political actors, which gives more voice to every level, has more participation, will give you a more realistic understanding of the problem itself, right? And that is likely to give you slightly better solutions, which means, of course, the problem is that it means that your forms of your intervention, whether it's mission, scheme, policy, law, whatever form it takes, okay, that form of intervention has to be also thought anew. I don't see us having much of a choice. We really want to change, because remember, we are not the first people to have these discussions. I'm pretty sure, we look at a book like Everybody Loves a Good Drought. What is different in the kind of analysis that we see there, 30, 25 years ago about the rural. So I think it's time we took on this multiple kind of set of kind of wake up calls, took them seriously, and then developed policy and intervention forms that are more like are realistic, therefore perhaps not as expensive, and more enduring in their positive benefits.
Yeah. So taking clue from Himanshu, I like to pose one question to Banashree. The Himanshu is talking about we focus more on the product, that is the brick and mortar approach of any kind of interventions rather than the underlying process or the system vulnerability or the structural inadequacies. So as you have a long experience of working in informal settlements, because that is the highest form of informality which affects which are there in different countries of similar socioeconomic structure like us. So can you give some your evidence which probably you have come across also of similar socioeconomic structure like India, where probably the most obvious things are there also, what Himanshu has told, or what maybe in the question on the chat box people are saying. Are there any evidences of informal settlements where not the brick and mortar approach, but more of a progressive and more of a less cosmetic kind of approach made an impact on the life and livelihood of the not even the slums, but down the line, the informal settlements. So can you just throw some light on that, if there are some examples?
Okay, let me first start with what happened in India. Like Souvanic, you mentioned earlier that we were talking about every whether it's the electronic media or the newspapers, they were all talking about Dharavi as the hotspot. Yeah. And here in Delhi, we were talking about the central districts, of Delhi, which were really badly affected. Yeah. But then came a time, and then there was this whole thing, let's take this opportunity and raise Dharavi to the ground, redevelop it, and all sorts of things like that. Huh? But then there came a time when there was a turnaround. Yeah. So the lesson and what happened there, that it was really the municipal workers, the ASHA workers who are there present in these areas and who have a lot of information about each family, about the health status, about the nutrition and everything that is there with the ASHA workers in these areas. They were instrumental in pointing out the vulnerable households, and then it was the municipal corporations who actually requisitioned all these existing facilities in these areas, whether it's schools or community halls and things like that, turned them into quarantine centers, put people there, sometimes very brutally, but then they checked the progress of the pandemic. So that is a kind of an approach, I would say, that it is a disaster management approach. Yeah? And when we're talking about these or natural disasters, that kind of approach of people who are there already on the ground and who have that knowledge should really be the ones to take these kinds of things forward. Yeah. So what is also, and this also connects up with a couple of questions which are there in the question box, that what about mapping these areas to actually learn, to see that where these hotspots are and how they developed, what are the kinds of various things. And along with this, how do we develop all this awareness among people and have these kinds of, on a regular basis, people who will carry out this kind of surveillance and support role. And we see that if you connect back to the Ebola outbreak in Africa, Dr. Sasidharan, you would probably know, that this building up of these kinds of community structures through civil society groups, and then linking up with the health system, with the, with the municipality, has now become a big asset in the case of COVID-19 as well. Yeah. So, so that is a lesson that we can learn from these poor countries in West Africa, that these kinds of things are necessary. The other thing that you're saying is that, if you look at this famous program of, upgrading of slums in Medellin, for instance, where the strategy was to connect people with the city, to develop facilities, to improve tenure so that people could build their houses, and then also have places, community spaces where people can get together, and underpin it with a strong community development structure. The same kind of thing they did in Brazilian cities like Rio de Janeiro, as well as Sao Paulo, and the same structures which were then, the surveillance structures for, against crime, against natural disasters and things like that, have actually helped to contain COVID in those areas. Yeah? So in the Brazilian case, where, we keep hearing about all the, spread all over, but then those barriers where you have these kinds of systems in place, it's not as bad as it would have been expected. So I think this whole thing of organizing communities, and now this also, there was another question that the marginalization of civil society groups. I think this is a lesson that it is really civil society groups together with the community groups who can have these kinds of systems which are space-based, which are based in neighborhoods, which are based in certain wards, in sections of the town, who can quickly come into place to take early action against these kinds of things, whether it be a pandemic like this, or it be a natural disaster, or it be some kind of organized crime or whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Banashree. Renu or Tathagata, any specific issue you want to flag on these, what is discussed, or from the question box? Otherwise, Renu or Tathagata.
Go ahead, Tathagata.
Okay.
Yeah, Tatha, there is one question that 73rd, 74th Amendment to empower local government, but why has not been taken care in this 20-25 years? Is it willfully or by design, or by default, rather? By default or by design?
I think that's really a very, very big question. And the short answer to that, there is no broad political consensus to empower our cities. But coming back to this issue of the pandemic and the city, I think, now there is as so much noise has being generated about how our cities are performing, and how, the vulnerabilities and the fault lines in the cities are being exposed. I think, this kind of raises a bigger question. To re-envision our urban policy framework, and how, one big opportunity was that, this national urban policy was announced, but I think, there is a lot of the way it was designed, and it has been brought out, and the issues that it has addressed, it leaves out a huge area. And I think, the pandemic has now created a opportunity to re-envision our national urban policy and what are the roles of the cities. And the 74th Amendment were passed about more than 25 years back, but still there is a wide gap between what was envisioned and how they are being operationalized. I think also there is a time to revisit 74th Amendment, and in some ways, I think some of the objectives envisioned in 74th are not very practical in the given governance structure and political economic context. I think we need to go deeper into this issue and think about empowering of our cities in a much more graded manner. So see, I mean, we have cities of very different sizes. On the one hand, we have cities like Mumbai, which produces a very significant component of the country's GDP and have a population which is much larger than many European countries. On the other hand, we have very small municipalities of say about 25,000, 30,000, so even 100,000 population. Can we really have a same framework to address this vast difference in the scales? So I think, I mean, we need to have a graded approach towards, I mean, what is required at what scale. And we need to have a different metropolitan governance strategy and an urban governance strategy. We need to differentiate between the scales of the different cities, their institutional structures, the fund flows that comes from the missions, and also we need to re-envision the missions themselves. So now we have a mission from A to Z. You know, I mean, the other day I was, I mean, just going through the budget. I mean, every ministry has about some 8 or 10 missions. So, when the missions are announced, so there is talk about convergence, but who is going to bring that convergence on the ground? Where is that capacity? We need to re-envision our entire urban management perspective. And COVID, I mean, kind of opens up situation for that.
Yeah. Renu?
You know, I think a lot has been said and I don't want to repeat. I think one thing that I want to add into this mix of things that really, you know, as a number of them have said, is that this moment presents an opportunity because so many of the fault lines have become visible. And I think what Himanshu mentioned at some earlier stage is that this is not just about resilient, you know, poor communities or migrants, but it is about resilient cities. And so in a sense, how do we all see ourselves as invested in building cities which are more just, which are more equitable, etc. So I think there needs to be I think Kirti Bhai also initially started with this thought about how citizens from different, you know, walks of life need to feel more invested in the cities and in other groups of residents of the cities, and how we go in that direction, I'm not sure, but I wanted to kind of flag that up. The other thing that I just want to say is that I think given the kind of migrant exodus we've seen, including among people who we didn't think were circular migrants, but they also, many went back for a while, etc. I think one of the things that we also lack in knowledge and in terms of our understanding is these linkages between the urban and rural. And as we, you know, so again, this calls for this can link up to questions of even convergence of, I think one of the questions was about, you know, that, you know, if migrants do not want to come back to the cities, do you think it's an opportunity to develop rural manufacturing units in village clusters, etc. And I think one of the things is that our focus of the urban missions, I mean, some of their objectives of services provision and all, you know, is fine. But I think as a broader urban strategy, we also need to have a better understanding of the relationship of the urban and the rural. And I mean, these transitional zones also between the urban and rural. And in terms of the lives that span these different places, the kind of activities, social, economic, that span these. And I think the way forward in a country like ours, because we keep hearing that India is going to rapidly urbanize, but actually the urbanization is not as high as many other places. Even if you include smaller, sort of the biggest villages, etc. I think there needs to be a better understanding of those linkages, and maybe that may also take us forward somewhere then.
Okay. Dr. Sasidharan, I have one question I think you can take up, others also. So that you discussed about a plan for engagement of communities in the, for communities. So would you like to elaborate on this engagement of communities in
it is possible by having large number of primary care doctors or family doctors or the GP, general practitioners, as in other countries. See, all the countries in the world have even policies to ensure that 70 to 80% of the doctors are working as primary care doctors or GPs or family doctors, all are same. But India alone does not even did not even think of on those lines. We need to change that policy. We need to bring in large number of family doctors. If they were there in the periphery, nothing would have happened. We need a decentralized patient care and healthcare management rather than centralized care as we have it now. And it should be mostly in the government sector, not in the private sector. The American model of disease care management is the worst in the world, and India has just copied it. That's why the failure that we see here. So we need large number of family doctors, that too in the government sector. We should stop privatizing the health and education, and we need large number of good primary school teachers. These are the basic things to change all this scenario. Everything could have been managed in a decentralized manner. And then even that it all has to, whatever we have been discussing are the manifestations of what we do not have. Like the corruption-free political system has to be thought of rather than just discussing all these. At the background, we have poor distribution of wealth and corruption, which is very rampant. All these are important issues. Even the black money and transaction, everything is linked issue. We cannot just discuss one of these in isolation. We have to think in a holistic manner when you talk about these issues, and then only we can solve it. And we need to have a multidisciplinary strategy to bring out policies for the country to take it forward.
Okay. I have one question. Any one speaker can discuss about that. In India, we are following a planning model. In case of missions, we are having city development plans, or in smart city, SCF, the smart city plans. So separate plans for individual missions. Amrut, they are making a GIS-based master plan. And we have, on the other hand, out of 4,000 towns, we have a set of master plans which are quite long-term and quite static. So many of you have a background of architecture and city planning and engineering. So this question, I like to get your feedback that do you think that there is a need for physical change in the approach of physical planning also? Because parallelly we are doing master plans for 20 years, development plans, or we have a very quick fix smart city plans which are made in 3 months, as some of us are involved. So smart cities, all 92-page documents, and made in even not in 3 months, 30 days. So master plans which could not be implemented, made 10 years back, hardly 10% of the recommendations are implemented. And whereas the smart city plans probably made in 3 months, some of the cities might have implemented 50% or 60% of the recommendations or the projects. So what is your take on these fallacy or the anomaly of long-term plans and these mission-centric city plans? And what should be the way forward? Probably that is my last question, and if you respond to that, then maybe that would be concluding our session. The planning approach in our cities. Yeah, Himanshu or Banashree. Banashree being the senior most in this panel, can respond to this. So what's your take on this? The approach of planning or master planning or whatever.
Terrible of you. You make me sound like a dinosaur. But no, but yeah, I think your question is very pertinent, because now we have these various kinds of planning. And this whole thing of master plans and master planning, it's there in the background. It's the only one which has a statutory basis. Yeah, all the others, they have money power. Yeah, but they do not have statutory basis. Yeah, and so I think there has to be a meeting point, because you cannot, you know, you have to have some kind of planning which takes into account the public and the social aspects of a city, of even a larger region. And within that, you can have various kinds of strategic plans, which really the smart city and the city development plan, they are, that you have some kinds of, you know, issue at hand, and you want to do a plan, which then will come out with certain products, certain issues. But then you do need a longer term perspective, which is looking at, you know, large infrastructure, which is looking at, you know, for instance, places where you can have affordable housing and zoning. And there is still a relevance of that. It's not irrelevant at all. But I think the two need to be connected. Yeah? And you do need a kind of a statutory legal basis for planning, because you are dealing with private properties. You are dealing with, you know, people's lives. You're dealing with economic activities and so on and so forth. And that basis the master plan provides, however obsolete it might be. So I think there is a need for improving our planning process, making it more evidence-based. And what you said about these very quick fix kind of plans is very damning, because a lot of times they are prepared without a solid evidence base. They are prepared without a proper perspective of what we can finally expect in terms of cities. And I think in this panel, we have discussed enough about, you know, what are the ills of facing our cities. We've also kind of tried to look at the directions in which we could be going. Yeah. So this link between health and livelihoods and, you know, housing, for instance. Yeah. How do you get that? What you can do, and then to see that how do you provide the strategic infrastructure? The master plan might have, you know, broad proposals, but then how do you make it strategic? How do you make it something which becomes a reality? Yeah, and then how do you turn this whole thing about what I can say is the negative instrument of zoning? It says don't do this and do that, into something which can then be supported by strategies to actually implement, which can then lead to projects to implement things, much like what you have in the smart cities plan, or the you know, the affordable housing action plan. These can be discrete strategies, but we must look at it within an overall canvas of a longer term planning process. That's what I feel.
Okay, so we have now just almost approaching the end of the program. Now the other speakers may have 2 minutes each on responding to this question, that what should be the approach or the model of planning, whether in terms of master plans, what we followed, or we need some course corrections from there. So I request all of you to respond 2 minutes on this. Himanshu?
Okay, very quickly, I think the Banashree laid it out quite well. We have the in terms of what we have at hand, I think the development plan is one useful tool as a place in which to coordinate many different things. It has statutory value. I think it needs to be broken down. We need to not think of planning or the plan as this kind of program which you put through the implementation hardware, and what you get is a city that you desired at the end of it. We have to think of planning also as something that is an ongoing activity and devolved further down, which is what is envisaged with nature of planning activity itself has to change, A, in this processual form, and also B, in terms of the kind of involvement and conversation with the community and the city that is ongoing. I would just say that's the beginning.
Okay. Okay. Renu?
No, I don't think I have actually anything to add here. So, I'll pass this one. I thought Banashree and Himanshu have said, I very much agree with both those points together. Yeah.
Okay. So, other two speakers, Tathagata or Dr. Sasidharan?
Yeah. Yeah, I also agree with what Banashree and Himanshu has said. I would like to add to that. I mean, that planning has to be envisioned as a process, not as a one-stop solution. The way the mission mode plans are doing, plan has to be a continuous process. So you don't make a master plan for 20 years and then stop. So it has to be a live document. It definitely needs to have a conversation with the people, but it also needs to be updated periodically. So master plan needs to put in a broad strategic vision, a kind of a perspective vision, but also it needs to be dovetailed with funding patterns, which now more and more comes through the cities. So it has to be linked with those strategic visions, but also it needs to be linked to a city's capacity to carry out. Planning should not be seen as in isolation to urban governance and management of the city per se. So the three dimensions needs to be seen together. So that is my short take.
Yeah. Dr. Sasidharan, you have anything to add to what you have said earlier for 2 minutes? You please.
We have the potential. India is not a poor country. We are one of the richest nations in the world. The amount of gold that we have, which is lying unused, is almost worth 75 lakh crores of rupees. That alone is enough to take the country forward. And if you take all the hidden the wealth, India can move forward really in a great manner. We have the human resources are the best in the world. So we have enough wealth, we have enough human resources. If we put our heads together, we can take the country forward. And as a building block to that, I would say that we should have good primary school teachers to transform each student into good human beings. Because humanness is one thing which we have to nurture for the better distribution of wealth. Then we need large number of primary care doctors or family doctors, about 80% of them, like Canada has. And this is a building block to start with. So on that foundation stone, where we provide all the social determinants of health to every individual, healthy individuals, where less number of people are vulnerable. And that includes all these. Like doctors are looking after human health, you are looking after environmental health, the architects and all. And in fact, we all have to come together, and we recently have started a movement called the Social Health One Health Movement Trust, and which includes architects, doctors, advocates, judges, academicians, everyone, agricultural experts, all of them have come together, and we have started a small movement in Kerala. It is not to be conducted in Kerala only. We want to take it forward. All of us have to come together, put our heads together to work on formula and solutions to take the country forward. That's what my thought.
Yeah, so we have almost come to the end of the session. I just want to add one point in this on this question, taking clue from again what Banashree told about evidence-based policy or evidence-based master plan. Probably our master plans, the problem is twofold. One is we are following entirely a Western model, whereas the Western urbanization is based on industrialization. Whereas our model is more of the 90% informal in all sectors, starting from housing to governance, infrastructure, everything is by negotiation. So the master plan doesn't have any place for incorporating this negotiation thing. It's very difficult, and that's why master plans fail. And we are mired in the dichotomy of formal and informal, and most of our master plans focus on the formal sector of commercial, formal sector of industry, and hardly touches about the informal. It touches slums, but slum is not really the informal as we see. That's much more down the line. So that is missing. Probably that we have to really think about how we can include these 80% of different individual sectors which are informal, and how we can come out of these binary informal and formality. Informality means as if it is outside the law, so anything and everything can happen. And the second one is in terms of data evidence. Most of the master plans worked on the basis of static data, the census. So probably now we have all kinds of technologies with us, and a lot of crowdsourced materials are coming to us, real-time data and all. So what I saw in some of these Global South planning documents, I saw how this issue of real-time movement of people, real-time, even the informal sector, how they are being mapped in real-time basis, mapped in spatial and real-time basis. Probably that is the thing which we have to really do a lot of research in academics, and also that has to fit to the profession. So that's my point on these. Otherwise, this will remain in the shelf, and hardly there is anything will be implemented, and we will continue. So I now, with all of your permissions, I like to invite Kirti Bhai to have just a concluding remark, and then we'll close the seminar with thanks to everybody for participating with their very expert opinion and wisdom.
No, I have nothing to conclude. It was a remarkably good and informative and well-conducted session. Very grateful to Tathagata and all the panel members. All I want to kind of say is what I always say, that we have enormously complex problem. Urbanization is not easy. We know very little. We don't have system in place. We take huge amount of time to do things, 25 years even to deal with 73rd, 74th Amendment. And cities are growing. Within 30 years, we would be somewhere between, we will have 840 million people in our cities, double the population. And therefore, it's absolutely essential that people like us who know, who understand, who studied, who analyze, get activated, don't depend too heavily and too much on government, and it has a role to play, but I think it has huge limitations, and get active in terms of how do we deal with this situation. If we don't, I honestly believe that major problems await us, and it's our responsibility that we start taking responsibility and start working together, get into collaborations, get to form coalitions, use our expertise and skills, and start dealing with issues one by one. We have so much to do that unless we start now, we're not going to go very far. And this is not prophecy of doom. This is statement of reality. If we don't act, we have major problems waiting for us in terms of our cities. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your wisdom. We are very grateful to everyone. Thank you very much. And I thank you very much for the participants whom I'm not able to see, but we are very encouraged by your presence. Let me tell you, the next webinar is on the 10th of this month. It's on a very interesting subject, very different format. We would have something like 12 people from the communities telling us about how they see our cities, how they see cities solving their problems, what their aspirations are, and where they think the cities need to go. So please come, please attend, and please be part of this process. Thank you very much.